This is section 6.1, part 4. Now we're going to begin factoring by grouping. When you look at your factor tree, your factor flow chart, that's hard to say, the first thing you do is you factor out a GCF if you have one. So we are going to be talking about that every time. It is always your first step. All right, and then you're going to ask yourself, do you have 4 terms? We will have 4 terms, okay, in this section. So if you have 4 terms, then you're sent off this way, and we're going to factor by grouping, okay? So let's look at this. Factor by grouping. Now there are several ways to talk about doing this. This is the way I've found that is most understandable. Once you get good at this, you might be able to use some shortcuts. The first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you have a plus sign in the middle. Now there are 2 ways you can fix that if you don't, like we're not going to here. We can either move things around, switch things around so that we do have that, or we can change a minus sign into plus a negative. So if I gave you x minus 3, this is the same thing as x plus negative 3. This will be the trick we use sometimes. Sometimes we will reorder, okay? All right, so on this problem though, I have my plus sign in the middle, so everything is good. Now we are going to group this together. We're going to treat it like it's 2 problems. I should have said we're going to factor out the GCF first. What I tend to do is I look at the first 2 and I see if there's something I can factor out of those 2. Here I could factor out an M, and that would be all. Nothing else would factor out of these 2. But I don't have an M here, so there's nothing that works for all of them. You could also compare just these 2 and you have nothing in common. Okay. So now we're to factoring by grouping. We have our plus sign. I'm going to add some grouping symbols here. I use brackets here rather than parentheses only because I find that they're easier to put into the written problem without covering it up. Parentheses are a little bit harder. They're the same thing anyway. So now I'm going to treat these as 2 separate problems. What could I factor out of these 2? Well, my GCF for these 2 would be an M. So I'm going to factor out an M. And think of this as a distribution. M times what gives me 5M? 5. M times what gives me M times N? Plus N. Okay. Now what you want to do now is you want to bring down this plus sign. Do not lose it. Okay. If you lose it, you tend to make big mistakes. All right, now let's look at this problem. I have a 20 and I have a 4n. I don't have a variable in both of them, so I'm not going to have that. My GCF might be 4. Does 4 divide evenly into 20? Yes. So I'm going to factor out a 4. 4 times 5 gives me 20, plus 4 times n gives me 4n. Okay. Now at this point, if factoring by grouping is going to work, we should have the same thing here and here. Okay, that's our goal, is to factor by grouping and then end up with 2 parentheses that are exactly the same. Now, technically, these are now a GCF and I factor them out. I find that my students have a hard time understanding that until they get a lot more practice. So for right now, what I suggest that you do is you think of these as collapsing into one set of parentheses and write it down once. And then you make a set of parentheses out of the parts you have left. I have an M and I have a plus 4. That's why you can't lose the plus. So this set of parentheses here will be M plus 4. Okay. Now just for this problem, I'm going to do a check to prove to you that it works. I'm going to multiply these 2 things back together. So Let's think of this as a distribution. 5 times m is 5m. 5 times 4 would be plus 20. N times m is nm or mn. It doesn't matter. And we just have a problem writing them out of alphabetical order. Everybody does. And then n times 4 would be 4n. Compare this to this. They're in a different order, but I do have the same thing. 5m, here's my plus 20, mn, and the 4n. So basically, we have undone some multiplication there.